last Thursday, and it was up somewhere in the middle. But while we were there, it was the red alert app was just going off, and then but it was mostly up in the north, and we were down close to Tel Aviv, just a little bit north of there. And we were sitting down for dinner at a restaurant the last night, and our hosts that live over there, Joel and Lynn Rosenberg, it said, "Did you hear that? Can you hear that?" And my ears weren't tuned to hear what they were hearing, but they said, "That's a drone." And they were militarized drones that were coming in, and Israel was able to shoot them almost all of them down. But when we got home, about 2 or 3 days later, that very area that we were in was getting just pummeled by hundreds and hundreds of drones and some rockets. But still, Israel has an incredible defense system there. So, but anyway, when it's safe to take hikers back there again, if you're ever interested, get in touch with me, and I'll let you know when that's coming. We usually go for about 10 days, 10 or 11 days, and you'll hike somewhere in the neighborhood of between 100 and 120 miles over that period of time. And you'll see it differently than you would on a traditional tour. You won't stop at as many places, but what you see, you'll see it a whole lot better, and a little bit of adventure put into it too, with maybe some kayaking on the Jordan and down in the Red Sea. So, but be praying for your brothers and sisters in Israel. It's a tough time for them. They're serving God in a battle zone. And so, hey, here's a verse from one of the Psalms for today. Today would be Psalm 41 through 45. And I love the way that Psalm 44 starts. It says it's for the director of music. When you read that in the Psalms, it means like to the worship leader. And from the sons of Korah, it says, "We have heard with our ears, O God, and our ancestors have told us what you did in their days, in days long ago." And I feel that's kind of where we're at in the sessions that I want to spend with you, because I kind of want to reach back with a little bit of a view of what God did in those years, the early years after I got saved. And I got saved on November 9th, 1970, which I did the math wrong a little while ago. It's exactly today 54 years and a month since Jesus saved a wretch like me. And but it was in the beginning stages of the Jesus movement. Did anybody see the movie, The Jesus Revolution? Yeah. It was a pretty good depiction of the movement itself. There was a little different on the Smith family. There were actually 4 kids in that family, not just one. But it was a really good depiction of what God was doing in my generation at that time. And I believe He's doing it again. I'm really seeing at this time a movement among your generation that I haven't seen since then. And I'll say this now, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about this tonight, but I don't know if any of you have been noticing what I've been noticing in the church in these days. Not just our church, but everywhere that I get to go. It seems like young people in increasing numbers are leaving the church. I don't know if you've noticed that. And it might not be what you're thinking. Because I'm not talking about young people that are abandoning their faith in Jesus. What I'm seeing is a movement of your generation that are leaving the church on a Sunday to invade the community with the gospel. And it's happening in large numbers. The Bible sales are way, way up right now. And a lot of it is younger people saying, well, I want to know what this book says. But there's a movement among your people that I think is going to put, I think in comparison to what happened in the late 1960s and the early 1970s in that Jesus movement, I think it's going to go far beyond that, where there's going to be young men and women like yourselves that are so full of a love for Jesus and a confidence in the gospel, and filled with the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit, that you're going to be leaving the church every Sunday to say, okay, Lord, what do we get to do today? I remember the day that the Lord called me into the ministry, I guess you would say, or to preaching. And I was probably no more than 3 or 4 months old as a Christian and 18 years old. And I'm walking down the street in Long Beach at night, and there's nobody around me. It's probably 10 o'clock at night. I'm walking home, and I'm just preaching out loud everything that I knew about Jesus. But there's nobody there listening. I'm just kind of rehearsing everything that I'd heard. Maybe I came from a Bible study and somebody had taught a great Bible study, and I thought, Lord, I'd love to do that. And so I'm just rehearsing everything that I know. And I will never, I don't always hear voices, by the way, but and that should comfort you. But this night, I just sensed the voice of the Lord to my heart as I'm just preaching out loud to nobody. The Lord spoke to my heart and said, this is what I've called you to do with your life. This is what I've called you to do with your life. Which wasn't just walk around talking to nobody, but it was to share my truth and share my love with people. And for the last 54 years and a month, that has been my undying passion to do that. And yeah, some of it I've got to do as a preacher and as a pastor and as a missionary too. We moved our family of 4 kids. My wife's name is Joy. I can show you her really quickly. She's my screensaver. That's Joy. I have another version of this on my phone. Let me see if I can make it come up. And yeah, and it's the same picture of her, but it was a reminder to myself about my diet. So every time it opened up, I wanted it to say that. Can anybody read that? No sugar. And Joy said, "What is that supposed to mean over my face?" So I've changed it back to just her. But she's an amazing woman of God, and she got saved a few months after me. And her story and what she went through as a kid. Her mom died when she was about 7, and life just got weird for her, with different men coming in and out of her mom's life, and she had gotten married probably about 7 or 8 months before I knew her. And she said she was standing there at the altar thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. I know I shouldn't be doing this. And one day, not long after that, her former husband had walked her down the street in Long Beach with a knife at her back with a threat. And thank God she got out of that relationship. And we found each other in a place called the House of Zacchaeus. It was a Christian coffee house in the Jesus movement. And I remember where she was standing when she walked into the coffee house that night. It's now a Holy Moly. Anybody ever been to Holy Moly Mexican food? It's great Mexican food. Holy Moly. And I love to go in there and stand right in the place where Joy was standing and tell the person behind the counter, my wife of 50 years was standing right here when I first saw her. And I fell in love. But Joy and I have 4 children. Bethany, I can't believe I'm saying this. Bethany is 50 years old this last September, and then I've got Shannon is in her late 40s. Jeremy's in his mid 40s. Starlin is in her late 30s, and we have 10 grandchildren that we can get our arms around. One is in heaven, a miscarriage, and I can't wait to meet that one. And here's how I vision in my mind it's going to happen. I'm going to be standing there in heaven. And all the people that you wanted to see, you're going to get to see them. And everyone's going to be patient in heaven. So there'll be a line off to this side waiting to talk to you. And some of them might say, I just want you to know it was what you said this day on that time. That's one of the reasons I'm here. You were one of the 14 people in my life that brought me to Jesus. And but I think that, we don't know if it was a boy or a girl, but I can't wait for that little one to come up to me and say, hey, there's no way you could know me, but you're my papa. You're Papa Bill. I know that's going to happen. So, and now we've got those 11, the 10 that are within our reach, and we just found out on Thanksgiving that my youngest daughter, Starlin, is expecting another child. So there's going to be a total of 12. I'm thrilled with the family God's given us and what He's doing in and through them. But I've just made a change in what I wanted to share with you in this session. I'm going to save what I was going to do for tonight. But I want to ask you to turn to, I'm torn on both of these. So I think I'm going to ask you to go to Matthew chapter 16. Rick, I bet you know what this is like, that when you get opportunities to do this, it's not so much what am I going to say, but what am I not going to say? Because you can stand up after years of ministry and walking with Jesus and turn on the fire hose, and it's almost endless with the stories. But in Matthew chapter 26, this is going to kind of lay into this whole thing about invading this world that we live in. Somewhere towards the middle, I guess, maybe towards the middle or the first part of the second half of Jesus' ministry, those 3.5 years, he takes this trip with his disciples, and he takes them north. He takes them way north from Galilee, all the way up to the very, and we always go there on both the hiking tours that we do and the traditional tours, and we end up at a place called Caesarea Philippi. There's a lot of Caesareas. Anybody know what Caesarea stands for? What's in the name Caesarea? Caesar. So there's lots and lots of Caesareas in the old Roman world because it was a way of sort of tipping your hat towards the guy that could end your life if you're not on the right side of him, the Caesar. So Jesus has taken a road trip with his disciples. And we all know how they traveled, right? They traveled by foot. And so here in, okay, let me find it again. I had it marked just a moment ago. Okay, here we go. In chapter 16, verse 13. So Jesus moving around with his disciples, and they walked north, and it says in verse 13, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And so they said, some say you're John the Baptist. Some say Elijah. And others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Can you believe that was the word on the street of who Jesus was? People were saying he's a reincarnation of some other wonderful person who's come around. John has been executed by now. And so they were saying kind of nonsense things. That, well, some say you're not like John the Baptist, that you are John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're Jeremiah. All these big names. Or maybe one of the other prophets. And then he said to his crowd like this, about half of this size, a dozen people that were traveling with him, he said, but who do you say that I am? How would you describe me? And then Simon Peter, he answered and said, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. What's he saying? You got an A on the quiz. You answered it right. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades or hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Now you could put in the margin there, tell no one yet, because he would eventually tell them what? Yeah, he would say, go everywhere. Tell everyone that their sins can be forgiven and tell them who he is. So Father, I pray as we look at this passage, you would give us understanding and maybe an excitement, Lord, about serving you in these days. In Jesus' name. This area, Caesarea Philippi, up in the very north of Israel, was known even in Jesus' days as the pagan north. And if a college-age student or college-age young man or woman said, "Hey, Mom, I'm packing up with a few of my friends here in Jerusalem, and we're going to go on vacation. Is that okay with you? We'll look out for each other." "Well, honey, where are you going to go?" "Well, we're going to Caesarea Philippi." And no parent would say, "Oh, have a wonderful time." They would block their road, say, "What in the world are you going up there for?" And you can see the relics. You can see the residue from the paganness that was up in the north, the altars. There was and you can read about the history of this. When God laid out the sort of the map on where the 12 tribes of Israel would, the real estate that they would have in the nation of Israel, the nation of Dan was way down in the southern part. And at one point they decided, we're moving up to the north. And so they were moving all the way up into that top corner. I don't know that it was the whole tribe of Dan, but a significant portion of Dan moved way up into the north, into the pagan north. And it wasn't long before they were impacted by the paganism. And it began to affect them or infect them. And there's one place that you typically go when you go up to the north around Caesarea Philippi. You visit the remains or the ruins of the city of Dan. And one place that they'll always walk you out to, if all the people can walk, it's a little bit of a hike, but it's not hard. Go through the beautiful stream path that takes you up to an altar. And the altar is about, it's a little bit, well, it's close to this dimension here, square, the measurement across the front of the room here, and not much square, maybe a little bit smaller. And they built out of iron the outline of what that altar would have looked like. And on the four corners, there's these horns that come up. And the horns were posts, basically, to tie the sacrifices down to the altar as animals were being sacrificed. Not like in the altar in the temple, not like the altar in the tabernacle. These were offerings to pagan deities. And I imagine how and I've wondered, but I've kind of imagined how the slow degradation or the slow turning from the faithful worship of Yahweh to beginning to worship these pagan deities would have happened as the Jews moved to the north. And I'm sure to begin with, well, honey, we're gonna stay true to the faith of our fathers. We're Jews, and we're gonna continue to worship as Jews. But you move into a culture where that culture has gravity. It has a pull. And you've got some friends that offer sacrifices, and even human sacrifices, on altars just like that. And they're your friends down the block, and they invite you over for dinner, and you're eating strange foods with them. They say, "Hey, you might want to come to one of our festivals." And maybe slowly, step by step, you end up in some compromise that you never thought you'd find yourself in. There was a book written by James Michener, oh gosh, back in the 70s, I think. It was called The Source. And my wife read it. And she said she could never understand how the Jews could come to the place like they did in Jerusalem, where they were offering their children on altars in the Hinnom Valley that surrounds the lower part of Jerusalem outside the walls, how they could ever be coaxed into doing that. But James Michener, the way that he describes it, how it happened to this one Jewish man, and his desire to be in with the right crowd, and his desire, and it went deeper and deeper and deeper. And at one point, he said the priest would come around to the village and would choose, certain people for an offering. They'd choose a child for an offering. They'd take a paintbrush and mark their arm, and that child was to be offered as a sacrifice at a certain date to these pagan deities, to Molech or something. And we know that Israel got into that. But at this one point, along with the marking of the child, there was a promise to the father of the family if he would willingly be offering this sacrifice. And the priest would know if you were willing, or if it was grudgingly, or if there was sadness in your heart. that you had to put on this drama if you would be awarded the great prize as the most willing worshiper of these pagan deities. And the man's name in this part of the story is Erbaal. I can't remember his wife's name, but when it came time for the sacrifice and his child was taken from them and was put on the outstretched arms of this hideous image, that underneath it, it was almost like it was a fireplace. The fire was underneath, and this molten image was with the arms outstretched. They would put the child that was being offered into the arms of this deity, which now is just piping hot. And of course, there would be screams. And so the worshipers had these out loud, just outrageous, I don't think it was like melodic singing, but lots of noise to drown out the cries of the children that were dying. And if Erbaal, as he stood there, stoic, and allowing his child to be offered, his wife with her head buried in his shoulder to muffle her tears, and him scolding her for crying, that he was noticed to be such a true worshiper, and he got the prize. And you know what the prize was? He was chosen to jump up onto the stage of this worship setup and take one of the priestesses that was offered to him for a week or 2 weeks of sexual activity with her, and go into the back part, go into the private areas of that temple, that worship complex. And it's what his wife said in this book. What she says as he's being led away with this beautiful maiden priestess, kind of I guess you'd say sort of a temple prostitute, that she's saying out loud, if my husband had a different God, if he'd had a different God, he would be a different man. You and I are defined by what we worship. And to worship God with all of our hearts, it defines us, and it changes us, it transforms us. So when Jesus takes his disciples up to this very area, Dan is just up the way from Caesarea Philippi. I want to describe to you what they would have seen there, and I can use this. So you come up, and it is absolutely beautiful up there. There's the tallest waterfalls in Israel are right around the corner from there, and we always go up there and hike around that area. But when you come into Caesarea Philippi, you're kind of at the end of the use of that one. Let's see if this one works. Oh, it was working. So there's sort of a wraparound hill here, and there's a stream right at the base of this mountain. And this mountain, by the way, goes on up. It continues to ascend all the way up to Mount Hermon. But right at the base of this place, there's a cliff, and it probably drops about 60 to 80 feet from here down into the valley. But there's a cave at this point. And this cave had a name. This cave was called the Gates of Hell. And out of it comes a stream. It's a beautiful stream. It's just a refreshing place to be. And all along the base of this cliff, there would have been, in Jesus' day, all of these different structures that were worship places. They were temples of different gods. Over here, there was a really big building that was a temple to Caesar. And then there was one to Apollo, and there was all different kinds. Up on the side of the cliffs, if you're looking at it from top to bottom, there were all these little cutout areas where small little statues would have been put in there, and you could worship anything you wanted to at Caesarea Philippi. But when you would offer your sacrifices, you're asking God to bless your land, and you would bring a sacrifice, and you would throw it into the cave. And if it went down and was sort of swallowed up, and there was a drop on the other side, and if it was swallowed up, then I think if it was swallowed up, then your offering was accepted. If it somehow came back out, and I think a lot of them would have come back out because of the flow of the water, then it was rejected. But you could worship anything you wanted to along here. And some of it was hideous. All the way down to this one side here, where there were stables, small stables, about 8 of them, And they were the stables for the sacred goats. And in the worship of Pan, which had some imagery with goats, in the worship of Pan, and this is going to be gross. I'm sorry to gross you out. But right off to the side of the stables, in which would become, some of them would become like tombs for the sacred goats that died, there was a level platform here, and it was called the dance floor of the sacred goats. And what the worshipers would do, they would come and they'd choose their favorite goat, and it was bestiality with goats. How far will we sink if you're following and worshiping the wrong God? Why would Jesus bring his disciples here to say this to them? There's a great depiction of this from, you ever heard of Ray Vander Laan? You heard of Ray Vander Laan, Rick? He's a great teacher from Michigan. I can't think of the name of the stuff that he's written, but a tremendous teacher. And he's got this depiction of Jesus standing up here on the hill over this with his disciples looking down on the dance floor of the sacred goats and this whole religious complex. And Jesus brought his disciples there to a place where no good Jewish person would want to find themselves. Why would he do that? He brought them there to say this. See, if Jesus had, how many years did Jesus serve? I mean, how many years in his ministry? 3 to 3.5 years. If Jesus had 30 years of ministry, where do you think he would have gone? I think he would have gone all over the place. He had 3.5 years. And I think he would have taken his disciples where Paul went. Let's go to Greece, and let's go to Macedonia, and let's go to Rome. He would have taken them as far and wide, but he had 3.5 years. So what he did when he brought them here, he was saying to them, I'm sending you out to places like this and people like these. I don't want you just to go to tell the easy people about Jesus, those whose culture is very close to yours, and maybe even their faith system is very close to yours. And Jesus says, who do men say that I am? And he's standing there looking down on all this, and they say, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're this guy, that guy, or the other guy. And he says, okay, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the only answer. You're the Christ, and you're the Son of the living God. He's saying, you're the Savior of the world. You're the one that we've all been waiting for. And so Jesus said, Simon, you're right about that. He says, blessed are you, Simon. And my Father gave that to you. You didn't think that up yourself, Simon, but God gave that to you. This is Peter. And then he says, I also say to you, you're Peter, but on this rock. Now, preachers disagree on which rock he's talking about, on this rock. I believe that what Jesus is saying to Peter, he's not saying, Peter, you're the rock of the church. You got to read through the life of Peter. You'll see he wasn't all that rocky. I mean, he wasn't all that solid of foundation. He gave his life for Jesus. But he says, look, Peter, you're a little rock, and we could do some work with the language behind it. Peter, you're a stone. But on this rock, this solid foundation, I will build my church. What solid foundation? The statement, the truth that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the hope of the world. He's the Son of the living God. On this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not tear it down. Satan cannot destroy the true church of God. And I'll give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I think if you look through the ministry of Jesus, that's what you find him doing. You find him setting people free. You find him loosening the bonds of addiction. You find him chasing away fear and torment in people's minds. And I believe that Jesus took his disciples there on this little road trip way up to the north so he could tell them, I'm going to send you out. When I send you, where does he say to go? When he sends them, we talked about that a minute ago. Everywhere. He said, I want you to go everywhere and just tell everyone that their sins can be forgiven. If you take the four Gospels, this is kind of a neat exercise. If you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and some of it's repeated at the very beginning of the book of Acts, you'll hear this. Now let me see if I can get this in right order. Jesus will say to one of these guys, go everywhere and tell everyone. I want you to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And that's either Matthew or Mark. Then another gospel writer comes along and tells us, this is what I want you to say to everybody. Tell people that their sins can be forgiven. That if they believe in Jesus Christ, their sins can be forgiven. Everybody knows they're broken. Everybody knows that they're sinners. In their moments of quiet, they know they're broken on the inside. Until a new narrative comes along and people begin to say, oh, you're not broken. That's the way you were made. And there's so much misinformation. Such a huge portion of our culture today is so misinformed about what to do with the sin that's in them. Some are being encouraged to just embrace it. It's just who you are. But okay, so it says, go everywhere and tell everyone that their sins can be forgiven. Preach the gospel everywhere. Matthew tells us what to do with people who receive the gospel. Disciple them. Turn them into disciples. Baptize them and teach them, teach them, teach them. But I love the way that John's version of the Great Commission is written. It's in John chapter 20. And he's stepped into the upper room. And it's the night of his resurrection, the night after his resurrection. So it's the first full day of Jesus being out of the tomb, and he's visited all kinds of people. He's visited the women. He saw some of them on the way. Some of them had a visit with an angel. He's come into the upper room with the disciples, and he's visited a couple of guys that are so depressed, and they're on their way back to Emmaus. And I want to take a hiking tour sometime and do that walk that they did from Jerusalem to Emmaus and see how long that was. Remember that when Jesus sneaks up beside them and they don't know it's him? And he says, what are you guys so bummed out about? And so he's shown himself to all kinds of people. But when he comes in that night to the room with his disciples, door being closed, he says to them, among other things, let me turn to it. I don't want to mess this up. In John chapter, let's say it's John chapter 20. If you got it there. Here we go. John 20. Here we go. Yeah. John chapter 20, verse 19. That same day at evening, this is David's resurrection, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, peace be with you. Shalom. Shalom. And now when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Why did he do that? It's really me. Yeah, he's saying, this is really me. Remember this? Remember the wounds? So he shows them his hands and his feet. Probably, like you said, you kind of pointed to the wrist. He was probably, they probably drove those nails between the bigger bones of the wrist and the hand so it wouldn't rip through. But then he says this, peace be to you, verse 21. He said again, peace. And as the Father has sent me, I send you. And when he said this, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. That can be a confusing passage there. I know it means this at least. If I get to share with somebody, how many of you have ever shared the gospel with a friend and maybe they came to Jesus? You get to look them in the eyes and say, your sins are forgiven. Not because you forgave them, but because of what Jesus did for them. But here's the point. Here is the Great Commission from John. I just love the Gospel of John. If I'm picking a favorite, if I could only have one book of the Bible, I'd take the Gospel of John. And so he says this in verse 21, as the Father sent me, I send you. That's his Great Commission. And he definitely said that, and he said the other things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote down. But to John, he said, I just want you now to go do what you saw me do. Go where you saw me go. Say what you heard me say. Love the kind of people that you saw me love. I want to spend some time tomorrow on a few stories in the Gospels where Jesus goes, not multitude, but he goes one-on-one. Imagine he's got 3.5 years. That's all the time he has to get his work done. And he's going to take how much time to bless a child? He's going to take how much time for one person at a time? That's how ministry happens. That's how a follower of Jesus like you young men and women, that's how it's going to unfold for you day after day. There's going to be, I'm going to say this tomorrow, maybe tonight, or this afternoon, but I'm going to say this a lot. I hope that this gets tattooed to your heart. That it's how important it is for us, and you can maybe even imagine what passage is going to come from, to stop for the person in the middle of your road. When I became a pastor, I had visions of, it's going to be a big church. Oh, Lord, you're going to bless this. It's going to be big. We're going to have to do multiple services. It wasn't until I came to Huntington Beach almost 28 years ago now, that we needed to have a second service ever. And I was always looking at as a preacher? I'd stand up there and I'd look at the empty seats. My focus was on the empty seats instead of the ones that were filled with the people that had come. Because big is always better, isn't it? Huge is better than small. But I see Jesus as one of the most encouraging things about Jesus. He took time for the broken individual. When he had, and he knew his days were dwindling, and he still took time on the way to Jerusalem that last time to stop for a blind man beside the road. He took time for a tormented soul or a grieving family. And so, again, what John is just saying is, you watched me. Jesus said, you watched me. Now go do what I did. Go do what I did. And what do you see the disciples doing that you see Jesus doing? Can you think of any of the miracles of Jesus that you see it happening in the book of Acts too? Like which ones? Healing? Anything else? Oh.
Kind of like thing. I don't know the exact story, but isn't there a scene where like Peter's kind of what Peter's robe was that, and someone maybe that or that he's similar to the story.
Oh yeah.
When someone touches Jesus' robe.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact story.
Yeah, and there's something like that where the people are thinking that it's like a tactile sort of a thing. Or they would take the handkerchiefs and stuff from, was that Paul? Rick, do you remember that story where they'd take his handkerchiefs? And I can't explain how I'm not going to get gross there, but just a handkerchief would be anything pleasant to give to somebody. But, there's one thing that Jesus did I never see his disciples doing. I'm not saying they didn't. Maybe it just didn't make the book. I never see any of them embracing a leper. But Jesus did that. But he says, I want you to just go do what I've done. And I think, that's the core of what it means to be on mission with Jesus in a time like this, in a culture like we're in. That's what it means. To be doing what Jesus did is to love the people that he puts in the middle of our road. And we'll get to that passage on that probably, like I said, this evening. But I'm so convinced that Jesus, as he took his disciples up to that area of the nation of Israel, there wasn't any place that he could go that would be more of sort of a microcosm right here of what they would encounter all through the Greco-Roman world at that time. They'd find these gods and more gods that were, some of them similar to them, some of them a little bit more unique. And he said, don't be afraid of places like this. Don't be afraid of people like these. Because what you're looking at is just another human soul that needs hope. And you've got the gospel. And you've got Jesus. So I'm encouraging you as you set the course for the rest of your life, how many of you know what your occupation is going to be? You're pretty sure what you want to go do. And how many of you are going to be in an occupation that's, you call it secular, or whether it's medical or business, or what are you going to do? You had your hand up. What do you know it's going to be?
I want to do nursing.
Nursing? What is it? Trade?
I would put my hat on.
Oh, okay, nice hat, nice hat. I like that hat, yeah. Anybody else? Some others are talking about that.
Marketing.
Marketing. This is great. You know what? Yep.
Maybe cosmetology.
Cosmetology again. Anybody else? I heard some of you talking about it around the table last night. Yeah. Zoology, yeah. Yeah. Who was the oceanographer? Was it oceanography or marine biology? Who was marine biology yesterday? Yeah, yeah. But you know, those are noble professions, and in the profession, you're going to have as much, if not more, access to people who need Jesus every single day than a preacher behind a pulpit locked away in his study. I don't let myself get stuck in my study all week long. That's one of the things I love about going out walking in the morning, and I have encounters with people and conversations with people everywhere I go. This shirt that I'm wearing, I got to tell you this story. It's the only clean one I could find this morning to wear. But in June, you remember what June is now every year. You come into June and it's Pride Month. And so it's a month of celebrating a sin that put Jesus on the cross, like the sin that I committed, too, all the sins that I was committing. But should there be a kleptomania month? Should there be a month for every sin? We've run out of months. We're going to have to stack them up. And a year ago in July, I decided that America was worth more than one day of flag waving a year. And so I went out in the park and at the beach, and I took a great big flag that we have at our house, and I just walked with this flag every morning through July. Every single morning. And sometimes if I didn't get it done in the morning, I'd go out in the afternoon or the evening and do it. And it was amazing as I walked with that I'd see, especially older people in the park, if they were sitting on the bench, the men would get up and they'd cover their heart, or they'd salute it. And a lot of people said, thank you. Well, this year, because of the slogan with the Trump campaign was Make America Great Again. And it dawned on me that if America is ever going to be great again, America needs to move back towards godliness. So this phrase kind of hit me. I went to a t-shirt shop and I said, can you make me a couple of those? And so I'd walk in the morning. And it was very interesting what kind of conversations started with this shirt. A lot of them were positive. A lot of people would wave at me. Some would wave at me with less than all 5 fingers and with a very different demeanor about them. And some would want to argue with me. And I remember this one guy, I was doing this little Instagram broadcast live while I was walking this one morning, and I had my headphones in, so I couldn't hear this guy, but he was walking a dog, and I could tell he was speaking very loudly at me, and it didn't look like he was happy, but I couldn't understand it. So I finished this up, and I turned it off, and I said, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear what you were saying. Whoo! I wish I hadn't heard what he was saying. But he came down so hard. He said, I'm not going to vote for Trump and that. I said, sir, calm down and read this again a little bit more carefully this time. This doesn't have anything to do with Trump. This has to do with a call for our nation to come back to God. And, it has opened a lot of conversations. And we started walking on, I had a lady that came to me and said, oh, Pastor Bill, I want to go walk with you in the morning. I said, no, I'm walking by myself. But on Saturday, I'll tell you what, we're going to invite anybody that wants to walk, bring a flag, and we'll start at the church, and we'll walk down Beach Boulevard. And so we did that and I decided, by the way, I wasn't going to just do it in July. I decided this year I'm walking all the way until November 5th. And so every Saturday there'd be a bunch of us out there, and the horns are honking. But you know what? It was an opportunity to open up conversations, and had an incredible conversation one day with a young man that was a YouTuber, and he said, "Can I interview you and get some video, and I want to post this up and all that." But you don't need to print T-shirts to open up conversations, but be ready for those opportunities that will present themselves. Step into it, and here's a super simple prayer, and you don't need to jot it down verbatim, but just ask God, what do you want to do through me today, Lord? Or maybe you even have an encounter and it's sort of in process. It's going on and you're right there and it's like, okay, what am I going to say, Lord? And you just kind of under my breath, I say, Lord, what do you want to do with this? Give me your heart for this person. And you'll be surprised how maybe what you've been reading in the Word that day, thought that comes to mind, and move into it and step into it. It's an amazing thing to watch how God will open those doors as you go to people like that in places like those where there's darkness and there's hopelessness and there's a need for truth. And ask God to soften the hearts as you move through that. But so I want to look at this as kind of the foundation for what I want to talk about tonight, and then a bit tomorrow, and then the last session on Wednesday morning, about being ready to go where Jesus is going and to do what Jesus was doing. One thing you can never do that Jesus did, you can never die for the sins of people because your blood won't save anybody. You might, some of you might be called to lay down your life for another person, but it's only Jesus that can save them. But that encounter they have with you, the love that they feel from you, the time that you give them. How many of you have ever had a friend ask you a question you did not have an answer for? The wisest thing you can do is say, I don't know, but let's take that to Jesus. If that priest on the day that my brother was being buried, if that priest had got up from his chair on the other side of his desk and walked over and sat beside me on that couch in his office and put his arm around my shoulders and said, Bill, that's beyond my pay grade. I don't understand that, but I know the love of God is here for you now. I don't know what would have happened in my life. I might have turned out to be a Catholic priest. I don't know. But if he had shown that kind of compassion, it would have been a different outcome. And I think it would have been a different outcome for me at that time. I don't look back and regret the path. I regret the decisions that I made. But I love, and I think about it from time to time, the way that God tracked me down, the way that he sent the 14 after me. And you're going to be one of those 14, and you might be number 14 for someone when you get the opportunity to say, can I pray with you right now? Are you ready to give your life to Jesus? Let's pray. Let's pray. And just, lean into it. Don't force, don't twist an arm, but be bold about your love for Jesus. Amen. Any questions? Any comments? Yep.
This is kind of random, but did you end up ever seeing the YouTube video that he interviewed you?
No, I didn't. I've seen posts of single shots that people put up.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Do you
one.
know who interviewed you?
Hmm?
Do you know who interviewed you?
I don't remember the guy's name. I might have written it down on. I think I did, but I don't remember it now. He was a nice guy. He was really energetic. He was running up and down the street, getting angles from different sides. Got to share with him about Jesus. But yeah, anybody else? All right, let's pray. And Father God, I thank you for the simplicity of the gospel. I thank you for how powerful it is that you loved us so much that you sent the only Savior the world would ever know, the true Savior, Jesus. And thank you, Father, that you sent people our way to tell us about him. Friends and parents, and maybe grandparents and teachers. Thank you, Father God, for pursuing us when we were not pursuing you. And God, I pray that you give us a heart for the people that will be in the middle of our road in the days ahead. And God, I pray for my young brothers and sisters here that as they continue to pursue your will for them and make decisions about occupation and the investment of their life, that it would just be led by your Spirit. And I thank you, Father God, for the work you've done in this semester and the semester that's yet to come. And God, I know there's going to be great things that come from this as you release another band of servants into this world to touch this world for you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. See you guys. Bless you.
Take 5, guys. See you back here 5 minutes.
You want this, Rick? Do you want this?
Ask questions.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't ask them when I was there.
that's fine.